I'm Professor Paul Behrens. I'm at the University of Oxford and I work at the Oxford Martin School. My research focuses on how to reduce the massive impacts of our food systems on the environment, but also how to improve the resilience of the food systems to all of the environmental damage that it's currently experiencing. So I'm thinking like losses due to climate change, due to nature loss, and how to enable food systems to become more resilient to the punches of climate change. I actually started off in physics, and I worked for a long time in the astronomy and in wind energy, and I sort of saw that the energy system transition is exceptionally vital, but a lot of the scientific questions had been answered. We knew how the energy system needed to look in order to reduce our emissions and increase our resilience. When I looked across the food system, I realized that we still had a long, long way to go, both in terms of understanding just the sheer breadth of environmental impacts from the food system, but also how would you transition such a system to something that's much better for the environment and much better for us. And for me, that is ultimately one of the most interesting and opportunity-laden changes that we can make. We always have to think about the messaging that we employ when we talk about our science. And for that, I think as someone who's more of a quantitative scientist, we have to listen to the qualitative scientists, but we also have to listen to the policymakers and the people working with policy to understand how do these messages land. So if I'm talking about the consensus, for example, that we need to reduce meat consumption around high-income nations because animal agriculture is the largest driver in the agricultural system of many different environmental harms, from biodiversity loss to climate change and carbon emissions. Then how do we communicate these issues? And one way in which we can do it is by saying things like plant-rich, rather than saying things like plant-based or vegan, or these words that can be sort of polarizing, that can be seen as very extreme. Well, actually, what we're really talking about is a big increase in the consumption of plants that we know are good for us. So fruit, vegetables, legumes, full of fibers, full of micronutrients, full of all the things that we know actually we need to be really healthy. And we've been told for a long time that we need to eat more of. And so it's the same message, but from a different direction. And I think that's one story that I often like to talk about, is that it's a story of exploration. It's not a story of abstinence. It's a story of being able to enjoy amazing new dishes rather than just cutting things out.
So the lexicon is a minefield, I guess. There's a lot of triggers in there, and I suppose it didn't help with George Bush in the early 90s saying he hated broccoli, I think it was.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lexicon, and to some extent it seems quite obvious when you think about it, but you really do need the social scientists and the surveys to show you this. And so, for example, when the Danish government did some surveys on how people interpreted the need for eating more plants, they said plant-rich was really the most successful communication device because, well, you know, who doesn't want to be rich? Rich in friends, rich in family, rich in experiences. Whereas plant-based, well, what's that really? Based in plants? I mean, it's harder to make that link.
I just wanted to talk about simplicity being an obstacle in some ways. We look for simple things, but we always seem to be drawn more to, or convinced by things that are complex. And, you know, if they say, well, just don't smoke, just don't drink as much. It's that simple. Just don't burn fossil fuels. So how do you think we get over that?
I think it's really interesting because when we look across the different transitions, they do seem quite simple in a sense. One is stop burning fossil fuels. And even if you go an extra layer deep, you go, well, we need more renewables, we need solar, we need wind, and that's become a lot cheaper. And, you know, these are simpler discussions. In food, it's eating more plants. But of course, where this gets more complex is we live in a very complicated social system where we're used to a certain production of energy, we're used to a certain diet that we've gotten used to over many, many years, and we've got vested interests, so fossil fuel companies, agricultural companies, that are very, very powerful and very, very influential in trying to hold back those changes, those simple changes that we could talk about. I think there are complexities that we do need to get into. And from a messaging perspective, we just need to have time. One complication that I often talk about is that we have done evidence that shows that mining activity would actually reduce in the energy transition. We would actually mine much less material, even in an energy transition where we have loads of electric cars and electric infrastructure for everyone. So that's not necessarily a future that I want to see, but making it hard for ourselves. Even under that case, we would still mine much less than we do for coal today. Now, that's a really hopeful message that we need to mine less of the ground, but of course the complexity comes in is, well, then we're shifting the geopolitics of power around the world. We're shifting which regions are going to be mined, and so we really need to keep into, at the top of our mind also how we do that mining and where that mining will be in potentially in equitable situations in communities that are struggling already.
The rich meat diet that we live on these days, it didn't used to be like that.
No.
I think people just assume that it's always been like that and we're taking away something. Could you just talk about the fact that a meat-rich diet is a relatively new?
I mean, yeah, totally. So the amount of meat that we eat a day is something that's actually very new in human societies. We never ate this much meat. And actually, when you look back at some of the periods where, on average, we were healthiest, were periods where we had such little animal food consumption. And so really, when we do models of how we see the food system changing, we don't go all the way to just plants. We actually talk about reductions to about a beef burger once every 2 weeks, a chicken breast once every week, some dairy every day. And this modeling shows that we get these huge environmental impacts because we're just eating so much meat today. And that diet, I should mention, is healthy for us and it's healthy for the planet. And so really the levels at which we're consuming animal products today is killing us because we know very well that processed red meats, some evidence that sorry, I messed that up.
Oh yeah, let's start again from the top on that.
On the whole thing.
Oh no, just on this section, I believe.
Okay, yeah. On, what was I saying? So we know that unprocessed red meats, processed red meats, and other meats can be bad for outcomes such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And so we know that these shifts are both good for us and good for the planet. I mean, ultimately, we don't get to healthy people without a healthy planet. There's so many different examples you can pull out. For example, access to green space. We're lucky enough to be in a park here, but many people across many areas of the world don't have access to nature. They don't have access to the mental health improvements that we know that we get through interacting with nature. And we know that when we damage nature and when we damage the environment, it boomerangs back on us. So now, after many years of failing to act with sufficient speed on climate change, we're seeing massive, broad impacts to all of the foundations of society, from water supplies, food supplies, to public health. We're seeing diseases appear in regions that we never saw before. We're seeing pests for agriculture spread. And so what we're seeing is this boomerang effect. We haven't respected nature, and now nature is biting back. Now, of course, we have all these wonderful opportunities in transitioning our systems so that we can be more healthy and also be acting with nature and not against nature for a healthier future. The real crucial question is, how do we engage with the population at a larger scale so that we can actually start to implement some of the changes that we know is good for the planet, good for us, and let's face it, mean that we'll actually survive and thrive in the future rather than reach a catastrophic climate and nature outcome. And that's where things get difficult and complicated. We often talk about things like our concept of systems transitions and our theories of change. Now, in my opinion, if you look across the country, if you look across the world, what we see is that the support for environmental action is actually double what people think it is. It's often double, depends on the question. So typically people will underestimate their neighbours, will underestimate one another. I actually think that that's one of the major blockages that we just don't see enough. And really, it's not hard to see why. Because if you look at the interests at stake, if you look at the people who are most interested in making sure that we don't understand that we all want change, that we don't all see that things have to change, it's those vested interests again. And so when you look across the media, if you look across politics, we see outcomes, we see efforts for change which are far too slow and far too small thinking for us to get us to the future that is going to be survivable. And so there's been plenty of examples of this. I could take, for example, the UK Climate Change Assembly in this country, so in the Citizens' Assembly. And in the Citizens' Assembly, they brought 108 people from across the country from all sorts of different backgrounds with very little environmental education. And they said to them, you know, we're going to learn about climate change, we're going to learn about the impacts that it's having, we're going to learn about how we might address climate change. And at the end of this process, they said, have a good think. What would you like to do? What policies would you like to implement to make this change? And they came up with solutions which were far beyond where the politics was at, far beyond where the media was at. They came up with ideas like frequent flyer levies, which is where we pay an extra tax on every extra flight that we take through the year. And actually, if you look at the support through of that in the country, that's well above 70%. They talked about banning SUVs, which was something that I found mind-blowing. I was like, wow, they came up with that. They talked about reductions in meat. They came up with solutions, that is, which are far beyond where we think the politics is at, where the politicians are talking about, and we think one another are at. And so what we see from these system transitions, from these theories of change, is that what we essentially need to do is keep moving that Overton window towards where the science is at, where the science is telling us we need to act. And to do that, we need to keep broadening the base of the people that are really engaged and really caring about this issue. And by doing that, in the way which we do that, we need to bring in people from all different areas of life who care about these different issues. So if you care about health, if you care about nature, if you care about food, if you care about sport even. I mean, if we look across sports, a lot of those sports are becoming harder and harder to play in the climate that we're currently experiencing. So basically bringing on this bandwagon effect of as many people as possible. And then research shows that a committed minority of people can actually help shift systems such that they are better for everyone.
Oh, that's great.
Okay. So, and we know that these companies, these big meat and dairy companies, they're actually targeting younger people. So they're targeting especially boys, but also girls between, say, 14 and 28, because they know that that's when habits are formed, when we choose what we want to eat, and when that is then embedded in our habits, it becomes harder and harder for people to change. And so it's incredibly cynical, and we have to be aware that when we're on social media, when we're seeing things on Instagram, and when we're seeing things on TikTok, this is often supported by the very industries that we know and us as scientists say need to change. And then there was another one, which was on. Oh yes. So one more. If that's okay. Yeah. So we know we need this change towards a plant-rich diet, and to some extent we have a huge amount of agency there because we vote 3 times a day on what we eat. Every time we make a choice, it changes the system around us, and then that system responds in providing more choices. And we know that when there's more choices, even meat eaters would enjoy those choices. So in lots of different scientific research, we see that in canteens, in other social and dining settings, that people are much more likely to eat those plant-rich foods if they are available and they're tasty. But that's not enough, because that's putting the emphasis all on the individual. And that's not okay either, because what we also know is that the food around us is shaped by huge forces of subsidies, of regulation, And so we need a systems change. We need governments to change how the food system looks and the choices available to us. And one really good example there is the Danish plant-based action plan, which has invested all the way along the supply chain, from the producers and the farmers, all the way along to training chefs on how to make really lovely plant-rich meals. And that's one way in which we change the entire food environment for all of us.
Can we talk about your book and using the title as a kind of an entry point to explain what it is that you're talking about?
Yeah, so great. So I wrote a book called The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, Futures from the Frontiers of Climate Science. And what I was really interested in at the time is I was reading so many books that were either overly optimistic. So we've got the most wonderful AI coming along, we've got energy abundance, we don't have to worry about anything. And then these other books which were saying, no, we've got serious environmental issues and we've got a real struggle ahead of us. And so in a lot of those books, what I was finding was, about 80% of that book would be extremely negative, and then towards the end there might be a little bit of hope. And so what I decided was, well, what would happen if scientifically, as a practicing research scientist, I really looked at the road that we're on, and then I looked at the most hope that we could have scientifically. And so I wrote a book in paired chapters of pessimism and hope on energy, on food, on demographics and consumption, on economics, and talked about how that might look and told the story of what that might look in the most pessimistic, but in also a most hopeful future.
What do you, I know we finished, but just what are your thoughts about the dilemma that a lot of scientists face, where they're accused of either being hopian or depressingly pessimistic?
So I have very strong opinions about this. So I think that scientists are always in this sort of interstitial zone between pessimism one day and hope another day. And there's all sorts of communication advice that we need to be hopeful, or we need to be more fearful, depending on whether you want more action. In my opinion, I think it's important to be honest. I think that's the most important factor, that we should be honest about what the science is telling us. But that we shouldn't leave it there. We should be, yes, honest and alarmed, but then we should also be talking about what can we do to change it? What action can we take, and how can we be engaged and enthusiastic about that action? And so what I think in terms of that discussion is that we should always be describing the road that we're on and how very scary it is, but then also describing how much there is to be gained by change in the future. And personally, I think hope comes from action. I'm not optimistic about the future, but I am hopeful that we can see more action compared to what we've seen so far. And I'm hopeful that when we do get around to doing the things we know we need to do at the scale and speed that we know we need to do them at, that the world will be a lot better for so many billions of people around the world.